Friends, let me welcome you all to the 7th Endowment Lecture to commemorate Professor K.V. Krishna Ayyar's contribution to the history of Kerala in general and to the history of Calicut in particular. Last year, we could not hold this meeting because in November, the pandemic was peaking in Kerala. So we could just not organize it. This year, for the first time, we are organizing it online. And we hope that circumstances will permit us to resume the physical meeting next year. We have also not been able to select suitable candidates for the Krishna Ayyar Fellowship this year, as most colleges and universities were not functioning fully. And we did not want to select candidates from available candidates because we wanted the best and we could not ensure a fair selection because of this. So let me extend a special welcome to our guests from USA. Mr. Manmadan is there, and there are others joining. And we have a guest from Singapore. So we have a global audience. Thank you. So our warm welcome to today's speaker, Ms. Narayani Basu, the author of the book V.P. Menon, The Unsung Architect of Modern India, which incidentally is the title of our lecture today. Her book has been so widely read and discussed in media that she really does not need an introduction. She is a young historian and policy analyst exploring the contribution of lesser known but key players in India's independence. She's based in New Delhi. Welcome, Narayani.
Thank you so much.
I have read the book twice. Once primarily because of my abiding interest in Kashmir and its integration with India. What really happened? Well, you have given very interesting aspects of behind the scene activities there. And the second time I read it as a family history because somehow I feel that it can be read as almost as a novel because it's so entertaining and so well written that I really compliment you for this work and hope we will have more such works of research and entertainment in the future. So, Mr. V.P. Menon has already written enough about integration in his two books, but what he left out was a juicy bit about the political conspiracies, the slugfest, which were essentially part of such a complicated exercise. And he has revealed these things much later in a series of recorded conversation, which he had with his former boss, Henry Hodgson. This record, I believe this record is runs into more than 20 CDs. And this is one of the main sources of Ms. Basu's book, apart from important official documents which have been declassified recently. So all these have found a place in this book, and I don't want to discuss more about this because a lot of people are eager to read it. Already after I announced this lecture, I have received more than 24 inquiries about where we'll get the book. I have sent the Amazon link because that's from where I got the book.
Thank you. It's always lovely to hear. It's always lovely to hear that there's so much interest in VP Menon. I just want to make sure whether everyone can hear me because I'm speaking via my phone. So the audio can be a little bit difficult. So just making sure once more that everyone can hear me.
Loud and clear.
Normally we have a brief presidential address before the main lecture by the president of Calicut Heritage Forum, Professor MGS Narayanan, who is the driving force behind our forum and also behind this lecture series because it is in honor of his teacher. Unfortunately, Professor MGS is slightly indisposed, and he has therefore given a brief message which our member Shrutin Lal will read. After that, Narayani can start. Shrutin, if you can hear me.
Yeah, sure. This is the message from Professor M.G. Narayanan. I'm happy to welcome you all on the occasion of the 7th Endowment Lecture to commemorate the contributions of Professor K.V. Krishna Ayyar, the pioneer historian of Calicut. His book on the Zamorins of Calicut is still an authoritative text on the life and times of the Zamorins rurals of Calicut till the early 19th century. Professor Ayyar was my history teacher at the intermediate level. He had instilled a keen interest in the study of history in his students, including me. He had adopted novel methods of teaching, including visits to historical sites to explain to the students how history happened. He had also written histories of Kerala and Guruvayur temple, apart from several research papers on various aspects of the history of Kerala. I'm glad to know that this year's commemoration lecture is to be delivered by a young historian who has achieved phenomenal success with her biography of VP Menon. The fact that VP Menon is the great grandfather of Miss Narayani Basu makes her task challenging, as one has to take extra efforts to remain objective. I believe she has used oral history extensively in writing this book. This is a neglected area, and I'm sure her effort will encourage others also to rely on oral sources of history. I wish the young author success in her future endeavors. Thank you.
Narayani, you can start the lecture now.
Okay. Thank you so much for all of your kind words. It's always lovely to hear that there is an interest still in VP Menon. Because when I set out to write this, I didn't really know too much about him either, given that he was my great grandfather. And it's often come as a shock to people when I've answered questions about how I've approached writing this biography, because writing a typical sort of hagiography of his achievements was never really something that I intended to do while telling the story of his life. That said, the procedure of sort of starting to research this biography was very unconventional, should I say, because given that this man played such a central role in the formation of the Union of Modern India and in the transfer of power, there was very little to nothing available in the public domain on him. And in fact, whenever I mentioned VP Menon, there would be a sort of confusion as to whether I meant Krishna Menon or, who was VP Menon. That was one of the major objectives with which I sort of set out to try and excavate as much as I could about somebody who had played such an integral role in events in modern India and had been so little talked about. One of my other major challenges was that since he was a bureaucrat, we don't necessarily give importance to stories of bureaucrats in history writing in modern India. It's quite understandable, because when you're telling the story of an independence movement, when you're telling the story of a revolution of sorts, you don't really want to hear about what the activities of a civil servant are typically associated to be. You don't want to necessarily read about paperwork and drafting of clauses and redrafting of clauses. You don't want to read about revolution in terms of paperwork. And that makes it doubly harder to excavate a human life and a human story from behind the scenes and sort of bring it out into the front lines of history, so to say. If you put that together with the fact that VP Menon was working alongside giants of Indian political history, he was working alongside Jinnah, alongside Nehru, alongside Sardar Patel. These are all household names. These are legends that we have grown up hearing about. In contrast, when you read a book on transfer of power, you will have paragraphs in which certainly VP Menon is mentioned, but it's never more than a couple of lines. So to bring that man out of the shadows, so to say, and into the light of modern day, was a task that was immensely unconventional. And you're right, I did use oral histories extensively while writing this biography, primarily because, as Dr. Ramachandran mentioned, I came across Harry Hodson's interviews with VP Menon in the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And they were a goldmine to me. As a historian, as a great-granddaughter, I had my great-grandfather talking about his time in government service, his interactions with the people you read about, with Nehru, with Patel, the process behind the scenes of integration and accession. Here was somebody who was talking about it and living through it through those interviews. So for me, his voice plays an immense role in the telling of this biography. So if you pick up this book, you will see VP Menon quoted extensively across the pages. And that's one of the reasons why I allowed his voice to do the talking, is because his is a voice that's been forgotten largely. And to me, it was only fair as a historian and as a great-granddaughter to allow him to do much of the talking. I think this became that much more important when you look at the kind of life that VP Menon led, because he was somebody who had never sat for the ICS examinations. He came from, a fairly good but not exactly privileged background in Kerala. He ran away from school when he was 13 years old. And this is stuff that's sort of gone into urban legends, so to say. So these were some of the legends that I heard when I started researching this book, was that he had run away from school after setting fire to it. And it's really something that you when you're a child, you do want to do it, but I'd never really known of anyone who'd actually done it. And when I went to Kerala and I spoke to the larger extended family, I discovered that, actually speaking, that is what happened. He was apparently really upset with the teacher who had failed him in his examinations because he came late to school. Now, he came late because he lived very far away from school and he had to walk that distance. And he was so completely enraged by this that he actually went ahead and set the school on fire. And then he was so completely shaken by what he'd done that he ran away from home. And that was the last time that he would be home for a number of years, at least until his marriage, which is when he was 30. And he ran away from school to a place called Kolar, where the gold mine, it was a gold mine on the outskirts of what is now Bangalore. And you had a very huge gold mine there, which was known to be extremely treacherous. that it had witnessed accidents, it had witnessed loss of life. And he basically joined up to become a coolie. So coolie boys were basically boys who went down the shafts of the mines, and they brought up the iron ore. They brought up the ore which would be sifted to pan for gold. This was a boy who had never done manual labor a day in his life. He had no idea of what to do, no idea of the hardships that life could hold outside his very pampered upbringing. And for him, it was a shock. And I discovered that these were actually the years that formed much of his character, because he was in Kolar from when he was 13 till he was about 18. So formative years of his sort of young boyhood to young manhood were in Kolar, which was not a very hospitable environment, should I say, to be growing up in. Eventually, he decides then to apply for a vacancy that's opened up in Kolar. So there were two vacancies that had opened up. One was a clerk and one was an overseer. So an overseer would basically do basically what the job described, oversee the tasks of the men who were in charge of sifting the iron ore, sifting the gold, going down into the mines, supervising each man had a specific quota that they had to meet. So he would be in charge of these men who were much older than he was. And I found it incredibly astonishing almost that he went ahead and applied to both positions. He had no idea of what an overseer would do. And like I said, he lived quite a pampered life. He was quite the favorite in his household. And he hadn't overseen anything in his life before. But he decided, I'm going to do this. And in fact, he was advised by the English supervisors at Kolar that, if you haven't done anything like this, why don't you take a clerk's job? It is fairly safe. He goes ahead and says, no, I want to apply for both posts, preferably the overseer post. So he's given the overseer's post. And in this respect, I find that what happens in VP's life is a combination of serendipity, in that he was, even though he didn't know it at the time, in the right place at the right time. He encountered people who were supportive in ways that possibly while he was on the spot, he didn't realize it. But, I have the advantage of retrospect and sort of hindsight, so to say. So as I see it playing out, it sort of fit into how he would carry his career forward. So he got the overseer post, and it started off all right. The men seemed to listen to him. He tried to befriend all of them. He would try and eat tiffins with all of them during their breaks. But there was an age gap, and there was also inexperience. So naturally, he started to be taken advantage of. This didn't bode well for him at a future senior career at Kolar. And eventually he was sacked from Kolar and sent to Bangalore with a letter of recommendation, which I think was incredibly generous under the circumstances, because while he was sacked, he was told very firmly that, look, we had told you that this was a difficult job and we had warned you to take the easier job. And it's not possible for you to continue here any longer. So he was sent to Bangalore, and this is a sort of family anecdote that's come down through the generations. But while he was working at the Imperial Tobacco Company, ITC, he used to go and eat his lunch under the shade of this big jackfruit tree. And it must have held some kind of significance for him in later years, because he eventually went and bought a plot of land that included that jackfruit tree, and it would become shelter in Bangalore, which still stands. And it included that same jackfruit tree. So my mother and my uncle sort of grew up playing in the shade of that jackfruit tree themselves. From Bangalore, there was a stint in Bombay. So basically, you have VP Menon sort of hopscotching his way across India towards the north. Again, this was a young man with very little idea of what he wanted to do. He just knew that he couldn't go home after whatever had happened. His father had passed away. He felt somehow that the onus was on him to continue sending money back home until he made something of himself. Now, he didn't know what that something was. In Bombay, he ended up selling hand towels on the pavement outside Victoria Terminus. And it is at this point, again, that you find serendipity stepping into his story. So this mysterious Englishman, and we don't know his name, basically came across him outside Victoria Terminus, and he was so impressed by what he saw. What he saw, we don't know, but he was so impressed by it that he gave VP a letter of recommendation to the Home Department in Delhi. And he said, go and apply there. In itself, this is not a strange circumstance, because the Imperial Secretariat at the time did take in peons, daftris, people who could do odd jobs and did not necessarily have to be qualified for the ICS at that point. So, it was not completely out of the way. So VP boarded a train and went to Delhi, and he arrives in Delhi in April in 1914. What he doesn't know, of course, is that the Imperial Secretariat inevitably packed its bags every summer and went to Simla to spend the summer in Simla. So he arrived in Delhi, goes to the Secretariat and finds that, nobody's there. So again, he has to go back to the railway station and try and find a way to Simla. And when he does so is, basically speaking, when his life actually began changing, though he didn't know it. In Simla, he was told that there were no vacancies at the Secretariat. He was persistent, and he said, look, I cannot leave. Even if you give me a temporary job, I will stay for the temporary job. So they gave him a sort of 2-month period to fill in for a clerk who had gone on leave. And they said, look, we can't do more than give you 2 months. And he said, fine, I'll take it. During those 2 months, only towards the end of May, did he realize that there is an opening in the Directorate of Statistics, which was a new department that had been set up by the British Raj, which was known for documenting. It liked to document all sorts of statistics, from agriculture to education to the census to mining. And the directorate had just newly been established in order to keep a track on the statistics that went into running a country. VP knew that obviously a new department would require manpower. And he applied. And that letter is one of the first letters that I came across while I was researching this book. It is an immensely old yellowing sheet of paper, which contains his application to join the Directorate of Statistics, and it's addressed to the Registrar of the Home Department at the time. And that is actually when I saw his existence in the records of the government of India in 1914. And that is when I first realized that this is a man who we talk about between 1947 to 51, but was actually in government service since 1914. So basically, this was a man who was behind the scenes of constitutional and political reform in India from 1914 all the way till 1951. And it made an immense difference to how I was trying to tell the story as well, because it sort of opened up a whole new landscape, a whole new political landscape that VP would inhabit over those decades. Between 1914 to 1918, he was very much a temporary man. He was bobbing around between various departments in the Home Department. Wherever there was a vacancy, he would be sent to sort of plug it in. But the Directorate of Statistics actually opened his eyes to what actually goes into making a country tick. When he was a little boy, his favorite hobby had been to sort of sit on the railway platform and look at the newspapers and read about how prominent men across the world were changing the futures of countries by signing documents. A piece of paper sometimes changed the fate of an entire country. Now he found that there was actually a lot more that went into running a country than just a piece of paper. There were numbers to be tracked, there were figures to be analyzed, there were different kinds of statistics ranging from subjects that he'd never even thought of before: sanitation, rainfall. He'd never really thought that you needed to keep track of these things. His stint in the Directorate of Statistics really did open his eyes to the nitty-gritty technicalities of what actually goes into running a country and what are the aspects that you need to keep track of. Political events were moving very fast at this point, and to sort of keep VP at the forefront of the story is even more interesting when you look at 1917, which is when Edwin Montagu becomes Secretary of State for India and makes a very important declaration in which basically he announces that there will be a greater push towards Indianization of administration. Edwin Montagu then decides that he needs to come to India to meet with prominent political and provincial leaders, and he comes to India. The British government is thrown into all kinds of disarray because obviously when Montagu comes, you will need a sort of entourage to follow Montagu across India. So you will need typists, you will need clerks, you will need people to basically keep track of not just Montagu's meetings, but an analysis of Montagu's meetings and what basically was the general political feeling in the country at the time. VP was sent to be part of that entourage. So he was basically attached as a typist. And he was then following Montagu across the country at this point. It meant an increase in salary. It meant a definite chance at becoming a permanent part of the Imperial Secretariat in some respect or another. And for him, it was a definite step up. What he didn't realize was that this actually would open his eyes to what went on at the very basic level of changing a country's political future. So Madison Montagu did not get on at all. And VP, as the sort of principal typist, eventually of what would become the Montagu-Chelmsford Report, was privy to all kinds of pushes and pulls within the team. Because they didn't get on with each other, there were obviously disagreements about how a particular clause should be phrased, what the wording of a particular phrase meant for the finished report in general. And it's overall sounds very boring, but actually speaking, it opened VP's eyes to the kind of politics that sometimes get played while important decisions are being reached, the kind of pressure that goes into forming what eventually to the common citizen or the common man is a finished piece of paper, a finished act, a finished bill. There is often high drama behind the scenes of that. And this was the first time that he was actually possessed with a front line to that. And this trend would continue from 1918 onwards to the rest of his career. By 1919, you had the Black Acts coming into being. You had Jallianwala Bagh. Jallianwala Bagh was a turning point for VP morally as well, because you had, an immense sense of tension prevailing among many young members who had joined the Imperial Secretariat, both within the ICS and non-covenanted. Basically, the sense was, these are the people who we are working for, and they are the same people who are murdering our countrymen. So why are we here in the first place? And it was a question that VP would grapple with throughout the early 20s. Because in 1920 you had the non-cooperation movement, you had the Khilafat movement, you had the country swinging in all kinds of political directions. There was a lot of political turbulence. VP's main question at that point was, where did he stand in all of this? And it's an important question that many young men faced. There's a lovely anecdote of by H.V.R. Iyengar, who faced the same dilemma and went to Sardar Patel with this dilemma and said, we are working within the walls of the Imperial Secretariat. We are working with a Raj that is trying to crush and repress our countrymen and their nationalist aspirations. Do you think what we are doing is right? And Sardar Patel tells H.V.R. Iyengar, look, the British are going to leave. Once they leave, we will need people who are trained. We will need people who are, proficient in the art of governance. What you're doing right now may seem morally abhorrent, but it is practically very sound for the future. And it's at this point also that VP realized that he could contribute best within the walls of the Imperial Secretariat working towards constitutional reform. And it sort of worked out for him in that he was drafted post Edwin Montagu's successful tour of India into the reforms branch. And he would never leave the reforms branch until, he joined the States Ministry in 1947. Which again, to me, speaks greatly of serendipity, because here is a man who, emotionally and personally speaking, was not somebody who was very pro sloganeering, was very pro, being seen on the streets at public meetings, making stirring speeches. That wasn't VP's style. VP's style, as he was discovering now, was working for change actively within an established political and constitutional framework. And if he could push for change in some way within that framework, that was what he was going to do. And that, he felt, was going to be his contribution towards the nationalist movement. And his joining the reforms branch was a huge, huge step towards that. It's also at this point that his work and the quality of his work was bringing him into contact with people that he had only just read about in papers till now. He was working with Malcolm Haley, Sir Malcolm Haley, for a while. He was the Home Member. He met Jinnah in 1925. Jinnah was part of the Muddiman Committee, which was basically assessing the impact of the Montagu-Chelmsford Report. And Jinnah basically took to VP immensely. And it's a lovely anecdote which VP sort of left out of his official narratives of the transfer of power. I found it in a very slim booklet that he wrote of his memories of the famous people and personalities that he interacted with during his time in government service. And it actually opened my eyes to the fact that here was a very young man who was meeting people that he hadn't dreamed of at this point. Jinnah was a rising star in Indian politics at the time. He was also a much different Jinnah than the Jinnah that we associate with in the 1940s. He was much warmer. He was much more avuncular. He was very open to sort of patronizing young men of promise. And for some reason, he took a great shine to VP. And he took him to lunch at the Cecil in Simla. They would meet again on the way to the Round Table in London. And Jinnah would take him in his personal car across Cairo. As I was saying, he was sort of interacting with very prominent personalities at the time. And it was being borne in on him more and more that given these extraordinary circumstances where he was interacting with important people, where he was making the kind of connections that he otherwise couldn't if he was on the streets protesting, it gave him a sort of foothold into being able to change the future of India in some small way. He wasn't as yet aware of just how big a contribution he would end up making. In 1927, he got a greater chance because as part of the reforms branch, the new boss that was drafted in was somebody called Sir Hawthorne Lewis, who was an incredibly intelligent Englishman of the Bihar and Orissa cadre and who was immensely experienced in the progress of Indian constitutional reform, as well as in the ways of the princely states. This was a man who actively encouraged young people to speak. And he didn't care whether they were European or Indian. And it was a great boost for VP at this point because, racism definitely was a thing in the civil services. VP as yet was not a civil service member. He would never be one. And he had no desire to sit for the examinations as yet. Despite that, Hawthorne Lewis definitely gave him a platform to speak up, a platform to air his views. They were always met with great encouragement and support. And it was actually Hawthorne Lewis who changed VP's life even more by taking him to the first roundtable in London in 1930. And now this was the first time that VP had been abroad. And going to a place like London, which was basically the beating heart of the empire, completely changed his outlook on life. So London in 1930 was basically just about beginning to suffer the effects of the Great Depression. The overall effects had not begun to be felt, but certainly unemployment was very much on the rise. You had a definite huge polarity between different parts of the cities, the parts which were richer versus the parts which were poorer. You had a suffragette movement which was very active. VP himself came from a very strongly matriarchal background. For him to see women actively pushing for their voices to be heard in politics and in the future of their country, it meant a great deal. He didn't know how he would implement it just yet, but he knew that this was significant. Here also, he was sitting on the sidelines of history being made, right? He was part of a secretariat that went to take notes of the minutes of the conference. So he met princes, he met politicians. The Raja of Sarila took a great shine to him and told him, if you are interacting with Englishmen, be sure to look at them straight in the eye and don't be afraid to make your opinions felt. And that was advice that he kept all his life. So when he came back from England, he was a very, very much a changed man. He suddenly felt that he had the potential to rise further in his political career. In 1935 to 1937, it was a turning point for India as well as for VP. So 1935, you had the Government of India Act coming into being, which was a backbone for political reform in the country. It basically talked about a vision for federal India. It spoke of federalism, however, on the basis of parity between the provinces and the princely states. And it would only become effective if a certain number of princely states sat in a newly formed constituent assembly. The first steps towards this were provincial elections, which would be held for the first time in 1937. Hawthorne Lewis basically gave VP the charge of organizing these elections, which was, as you can imagine, a big, big step for him. It was the first time that all the knowledge, all the sort of prowess that he had accumulated over the years was being called into implementation. It was also the first time that somebody senior had trusted him with a momentous event in Indian politics. And I think it didn't escape anyone's notice, even at that point, that this was an immensely momentous event. So he was in charge of making the electoral rolls for the 1937 elections. He put women on the electoral rolls. It was the first time that he actually brought forth the ideas that he had picked up in London and implemented them on a national stage. We all know how the 1937 elections went, what actually happened. The First World War happened before anything could come of it. Provincial ministries resigned. The Congress provincial ministries resigned, and you basically have VP sitting and looking back over the years on the tapes that I heard in SOAS, and thinking about what could have been if the Congress had chosen not to do it. Um, an important sort of role in how I was telling this story, because as you can see, when sort of now nearing the actual peak of the independence movement, we still have a decade to go, but it was a decade that was packed with not just with war, but immense the political scene. You have a definite push for Pakistan coming into being. Pakistan was very much beginning to be bandied about from 1939 onwards. Um, whether it's a definitive idea or not would only become very clear in the aftermath of the Simla conference. But it was a definitely changing political landscape. And at this point, to sort of locate VP was a completely different sort of task altogether, because again, I had to change tack as a historian to sort of dig behind the documents of the transfer of power. As VP, sort of in the backstage, right? Because every document, especially if you read Nicholas and Mansurg's 12 volumes, uh, inevitably notations from VP, there are inevitably memos from VP, uh, but they will always be very much in the background. There is correspondence from secretaries of state for India and viceroys that inevitably take center stage. VP has left behind very important memos, very important rejoinders to those letters and cables, obviously, which have gone as they were intended to, as footnotes in history. So the process of writing this particular last decade was completely sort of difficult, should I say. We see VP at this point rising to a point where he probably thought he would never reach, but it was also stymied by racism. It was stymied also by the fact that he was a man who had not sat for the ICS and who was an Indian, right? So you have Linlithgow coming in 1935, and BP would serve with Linlithgow, Wavell, and Mountbatten. At the absolute peak of his career and at the peak of the British Raj in India. Linlithgow was a man who was immensely fond of protocol. He was also very fond of keeping men around him who liked to listen to him. It's possibly not such an unconventional characteristic, but that is how Linlithgow was. Hawthorne Lewis was Reforms Commissioner when Linlithgow came in. Hawthorne Lewis was gone, by 1940. 1940, Linlithgow was looking for a new Reforms Commissioner. It was a bad time for the Raj in India. War had been declared just the year before. You had a burgeoning food crisis developing in Bengal. You had immense drama, like I said, playing out between the Congress and the Muslim League in national politics. It was the worst time ever for Hawthorne Lewis to have tendered his resignation. And Linlithgow was looking for a new Reforms Commissioner. Now, by rights, it should have been VP. Particularly since VP was very much acknowledged as Hawthorne Lewis's deputy within the Reforms Office. And in fact, in 1935, it was very much with Hawthorne Lewis's blessing that VP had actually dared to open his mouth in front of Linlithgow and say, look, if we want federation to succeed, as per the Government of India Act 1935, what we should do right now is to take defense, communications, and external affairs away from the princes and leave them to control their own internal affairs. We can get them on board if we choose to do this. Linlithgow hadn't listened to him then. And it was clear that Linlithgow wasn't going to promote VP at this point either. It is at this point that Harry Hodgson is hired. And Harry Hodgson, while he is extremely well versed in Indian constitutional affairs. He was 10 years younger than VP. He had cleared the ICS, no doubt. He had worked as the editor of a magazine called The Round Table, which still exists today, but in those days was a sort of literary attempt to understand constitutional affairs in the colonies. And as part of his job as editor of The Round Table, Hodgson had visited India a number of times in the 1930s. And Linlithgow felt that, here is a man who can possibly take on the task of Reforms Commissioner. Now, Hodgson wasn't trained on the ground for being Reforms Commissioner. He didn't know what that entailed. So for most of his time, initial time in India, he was away from the Reforms Office on training. There is no evidence of professional jealousy from VP here, which I found remarkable, but apparently so did Hodgson, because he left behind an unpublished memoir of his time in India, in which he openly acknowledged that, VP had every opportunity to feel professionally resentful of a much younger man, a much more inexperienced man coming in and sort of taking a post for which VP would have been very suited at this point. Both men would end up becoming great friends, best friends, in fact, and they worked very well together. But for the first few months of his presence in India, Hodgson wasn't around. VP was more or less in charge of the Reforms Office. And it is, in fact, in 1941 that he went again to Linlithgow. And based on the changed political circumstances, because, remember, we were in the middle of a Second World War. We were still about 6 years away from transfer of power and integration. But politics on the ground was changing rapidly. Pakistan and partition were words that were being bandied around. And he goes to Linlithgow and puts forth a transfer of power plan, which basically says that, we can have a sort of transfer of power with a coalition, a federal government based on a coalition between the League and the Congress. And in so doing, we can avoid any talk of partition. That wasn't listened to again. So you have events going the way that history books have taught us, right? In 1942, the Cripps mission comes in. It fails completely. By 1942, Harry Hodgson is immensely frustrated because he is beginning to see that no matter what he says, and Harry Hodgson was a very decisive young man. He was a man with very definite ideas of how the transfer of power process should go. And he was getting very, very restive and restless with Linlithgow, who was very clearly there to achieve something, to leave a legacy, right? Linlithgow basically came to India to see to it that federation was put forth as it was stated in the Government of India Act. And he was determined that this would happen at all costs. Even though you have the princes of India getting incredibly frightened by the prospect of federation, by the prospect of what would happen if paramountcy lapsed, what would it mean to give away their rights and privileges. These were all things that the princes had agreed to during the first round table. These were now things that the princes were getting very nervous about as, it became quite clear that India was moving towards some kind of conclusion as far as transfer of power went. So you had princes backing out left, right, and center from the idea of federation. So you had the dream of federation collapsing very fast. And VP was very upset about this because, he'd always been in favor of federation. He'd always felt that federation was one of the ways in which we could keep the country together. And it was clearly a sort of dying dream at this stage. In 1942, Harry Hodgson tendered his resignation and said, I'm going back. I can't do this anymore. And he recommended VP to be Reforms Commissioner. And it is at this point that VP comes into his own. It's at this point that you find him behind some of the biggest political political discussions in the country. The Simla Conference, for instance, was entirely his doing. He laid out a very elaborate blueprint for it, which is still present in the National Archives of India. In his official narrative, however, he leaves the impression that it was the Viceroy's idea, and it was basically speaking entirely the Viceroy's and his officials doing. But actually speaking, the document that lays out his plan and is signed by him is present in the National Archives. So apparently what had happened was that Evan Jenkins, who was very closely working with the Viceroy, who was Lord Wavell at the time, went to VP and said, look, what do you see happening here? How do you think we can take matters forward? And it's at that point that VP outlines the Simla Conference plan. VP was also present in talks with Bhulabhai Desai, who was at this point putting forth the Desai-Liaquat Pact. And there's this lovely story about how VP meets Bhulabhai Desai for tea at Durga Das, who was the editor of the Hindustan Times at the time, Durga Das's house. And they have tea together. And it's an illuminating anecdote of just how central VP was already becoming to the way that politics was being played out, and to as a mediator, as an arbitrator, as a back channels person. You see it also in 1946 when Jinnah is insisting on Deliverance Day. And it's VP who sends HVR Iyengar to Bombay to meet with Sardar Patel and ask him, to take over some kind of interim government without insisting at this point for transfer of power. In 1946, you see another huge milestone for VP in that it is now that he comes into contact with Sardar Patel. And there are so many narratives which call VP Sardar Patel's right-hand man, but if you look at the trajectory of experience that VP has gathered over the years, you can see why that analogy is used, but you can also see why it falls short, even so. Here was a man who had been quite instrumental in many ways, even though he was on the sidelines, on the front lines of transfer of power for decades now. He had accumulated a huge amount of constitutional law. He was very much already getting very familiar with the ways that the princely states worked. In 1935, he had drafted a sort of prototype of the instrument of accession. And this was done in order to sort of keep it ready in case federation did actually come to pass. So he was very, very, very experienced at this point, and he was known to draft extremely well. He was known to have what they called an eidetic memory, so sort of photographic memory, which is another sort of interesting aspect of his personality, which sort of went into urban legend, but turned out to be true. So basically, you could show him any paragraph in any book, and he could recite it for you word to word even a week later. He was known to be unafraid at this point of putting forth his opinions. He'd already sat down with viceroys advisors, with important figures in Indian politics like Bhulabhai Desai and Liaquat Ali Khan. So he had shown himself to be very, very capable. He and Sardar Patel were actually quite a team. Sardar Patel was incredibly reticent. He was known to be very taciturn. He did not really speak unless he actually had something to say. He was also a very, very pragmatic thinker, a very fast mover when he took a decision on something. And he had a very cool sort of head under fire. So as a team, both of them worked very well together. And by the end of 1946, you have VP and Sardar Patel very much a team. Wavell is referring to it in his journals as by referring to VP as Sardar Patel's mouthpiece, which is again a little unfair because by this point, like I said, VP had shown himself to be far equal to anyone in the process of formulating plans for the transfer of power. In 1946, yet again, VP puts forth another plan for the transfer of power. So if you look at this trajectory, he's already sort of put forth 3 plans for the transfer of power, all before 1947, all of which didn't come to pass. So we don't really know what would have happened had some viceroy gone ahead and listened, had Whitehall gone ahead and listened. We don't know how history would have changed. As it turns out, until 1947, his plan wasn't really taken into consideration. But in 1946, he did certainly put together a plan. Sardar Patel gave it his blessing. It was sent ahead to Whitehall. And Mountbatten certainly looked at it as part of his brief before he came out to India. But again, nothing came of that plan at all. By 1947, you have, an India that's that's greatly changed. You have communal riots beginning in January, February, spreading across Bengal, Bihar, Punjab. You have a tinderbox-like atmosphere developing. You have a new viceroy who's come out to India, who is incredibly flashy, incredibly charming, but has very definite ideas of how he would like to proceed with the process of transfer of power and how he would like to leave his legacy behind. For the first few months that Mountbatten was here, VP was never ever taken into the inner group of advisors that Mountbatten brought out to India. And he's left his resentment of that clearly on record. In fact, he did tender his resignation twice during those first few months because he felt that, I am constitutional advisor, I am a reforms commissioner. It is my duty and it is my job to be offering the viceroy advice at this point. And if the viceroy is not keen on taking my advice, then there's no point in me being here. So you had this strand of sort of resentment coming out, professional and personal, from VP at a point when India really was moving at breakneck speed. On the other hand, you had the princes being sort of wooed again. This time by Nehru, Patel, Gopalaswamy Iyengar was incredibly important at this point. We speak about VP and his role in integration, which is incredibly vital. But in the first few months of 1947, you have Gopalaswamy Iyengar doing the talking between Nehru, Patel, and the princes. You also have the future Indian state, should I say, making its intentions towards the princely states quite well known. There are some very revealing sort of statements made during the meetings between Patel and the Chamber of Princes, for instance, in which Patel tells the Nawab of Bhopal, who was the chancellor at the time of the Chamber of Princes, that insofar as you hand over your powers to us, we won't feel the need to take over your powers. Now, so you have that sort of strain of warning already laid. You also still have, despite that warning, Patel putting in place a model of very charming personal diplomacy. So princes were being, given lunch and dinner at his residence on Aurangzeb Road. There was a sort of very clever mix of ruthlessness and charm being deployed at this point. And VP would be watching this, and it was this mixture of ruthlessness and charm that he would deploy later when the process of integration actually began. The summer of 1947 is, a time period where so much has been written about. You have books that have been written exclusively on the summer of 1947. So I'm not going to get into the details of that. But what is fascinating here is that Mountbatten's plan, which he formulated, which was the plan that was very famously railed against by Nehru for balkanizing India, for cutting India up into little sort of pockets of anarchy almost. That plan was the plan that was the Mountbatten plan, and that was sent ahead to Whitehall. VP Menon never saw that plan. He said that he never approved of it. He never saw it. It is here also that he tendered his resignation once again. And there's another lovely anecdote that he left behind where, he's tendered his resignation and then he receives a call from Edwina Mountbatten, who asks him to come and see her at early in the morning the next day. And so he arrives at Viceroy House and he's shown into her room. And she's putting on her dressing gown. She says, what is happening? And he explains the situation and he says, look, I can't work under these circumstances. And she says, don't worry, I will speak to Mountbatten. Why don't you come up to Simla? Because they were all going up to Simla after this. Mountbatten was essentially taking all the Indian leaders up to Simla. The idea was to introduce Plan Balkan once it came back ratified from Whitehall to the leaders and see what they had to say. So Edwina basically says, you also come up to Simla and we'll sort this out. So he did go to Simla, and I think that was a pivotal moment for the transfer of power. And it is at Simla that things go badly wrong for Nehru as well as for Mountbatten and for VP. So Mountbatten basically tells VP, if you have a better plan, explain it to Nehru. Don't tell him that there's another plan that's gone ahead to Whitehall. And VP does this. He knows that this is not the right thing to do, but he goes ahead and does it. And he explains to Nehru the same plan that he had outlined with Sardar Patel in 1946, because he knew that if Sardar Patel had given it its blessing, it wasn't likely that Nehru wouldn't give it his blessing. And Nehru did. And that is the background behind, that famous scene where Mountbatten has a hunch in which he shows Nehru Plan Balkan, and Nehru has a explosive temper tantrum. The background for that is this, that essentially speaking, VP Menon was told to give him an entirely different picture from the actual plan that had gone ahead to Whitehall. And it's at this point that VP Menon is called in again and is told, you have to do something to save this situation, because Nehru was in a rage, rightly so. Mountbatten didn't know what to do. Nehru was going back down to Delhi in the evening. It was already lunchtime on the 17th of May. And so he had basically a few hours in which to put together a plan that could meet everyone's approval. And he does this. He sits without eating lunch, much to his wife's complete rage. And he puts together the plan that eventually became what we call today the June 3rd plan, which is actually the Menon plan for the transfer of power. And I found it rather touching because, when he's talking about it in the interviews with Harry Hodgson, he says, Harry Hodgson obviously says, what did you think? You basically gone ahead and written a plan that changed the face of South Asia forever, or that would change the face of South Asia forever. What were you thinking at that point? And he says, all I can remember is that I felt tired and I felt maybe the grammar was a bit off. And it's such a lovely sort of revealing anecdote, because it says so much about how you're working under pressure and you don't really realize the weight of what you've done. But you're thinking about things like, is the grammar all right? And, what happens after that is obviously history. It does get carried through. And we are finally on our way to becoming a country that is free from the empire's hold. There is still a lot that is left to be done. So 1947 to 51 sees VP Menon at the very peak of his power, and that is the period that we associate with him, right? We see more of him now than we've ever seen throughout his career. And it is a period greatly marked by intrigue, greatly marked by shifts in tactics across states, because you had so many different personalities and so many different circumstances to deal with. For instance, with a state like Travancore, you had an immensely erudite Diwan who was doing his best to let VP know that Travancore had no intentions of signing an instrument of accession. Travancore was already thinking of appointing a trade agent to Karachi post the transfer of power. There was absolutely no way, said Sir C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, that Travancore would accede to an Indian Union. And it's here actually that you see a very different sort of strain of negotiations taking place, because you have a political and strategic skein represented by Sir C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer. You also have a very religious strain here, because in Travancore, since the 18th century and since the reign of Martanda Varma, you basically had the Padmanabha Swami deity ruling almost state politics. And that is something that we see playing out in Travancore between 1947 to 49, which is actually when Travancore and Cochin were merged. At the outset, however, he had to deal with somebody like C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer. In Baroda, he had to deal with, Sir Pratap Singh Gaikwad, who was an incredibly hedonistic ruler who had committed bigamy, who was busily looting his state treasury, along with his wife, Sita Devi. You had Maharaja Hanwant Singh of Jodhpur, who famously flourished, a gun in VP's face. You had, Maharaja Holkar in Madhya Pradesh, who basically refused to do anything about the instrument of accession until the very end, when he mysteriously sent just one envelope with no emissary, with no signature on, no covering letter, no nothing, just a signed instrument of accession. You have so many different personalities that you were dealing with across the country. In Manipur, you had a very lazy Maharaja who was more into women than he was into looking after the welfare of his people. So you basically had Sardar Patel and VP Menon deploying a series of different tactics to sort of get states on board with in time for not just transfer of power, but afterwards. And it's over here that I sort of distinguished a shift between integration and accession, right? So you had accession before August 15th, 1947. So when you had 28 states already joining the Constituent Assembly before transfer of power, that to me was accession. That to me was VP Menon and Sardar Patel proving immensely successful with their tactics of persuading princes to join, princes or their chief ministers to join the Constituent Assembly of a Union of India. After transfer of power, particularly with states like Junagadh, Hyderabad, Kashmir, you have different methods being deployed. We all know the stories of Junagadh and Hyderabad and Kashmir, and they are incredible in their own rights. But they are the states that actually dominate the narrative of integration even today. Because when we think of integration of India, the automatic picture that comes into your head is of Junagadh, Hyderabad, Kashmir. All three states had incredibly colorful histories. All three states had very turbulent politics going on inside. All three states were strategically incredibly important for India to hold on to. So it's natural that they would dominate the overall narrative of integration. But if you look at smaller states, if you look at things that barely get talked about, for instance, the integration of Odisha and Chhattisgarh, those are the areas where you actually see a sort of administrative framework of integration coming into play. It's actually here that you see integration in the right sense of the word being played out, right? So Odisha and Chhattisgarh would form an overall framework for how states across India, particularly when they were constructed, when they were comprised of different provincialities within the larger state parameters, uh, get got integrated into one cohesive unit. You had, within the process of integration, you also had models of the privy purse being put into place. Um, and there has always been a sort of conception that the princes were shortchanged of how much they were due in terms of privy purse amounts. Um, that is a misconception, because as the records show, honestly speaking, Sardar Patel and VP Menon, and particularly Sardar Patel, were incredibly particular about the fact that, look, we are taking away so much power from the princes. It would not be right to start um, the story of an independent nation based on deceit. So we have promised the princely states that we will give them X amount in order to get them to integrate into the Indian Union. And that is the amount that is going to stay. They deserve their privy purses. And in fact, um, there was quite an argument in 1949 over this, because the government under Nehru had already started murmurings of sort of dissent about privy purses. And Sardar Patel was quite ill at that point, but he made it a point to come to Delhi and insist that this was something that he believed in. This was the principle with which integration had taken place on whatever terms. And this was the least that the Indian state could do and should do. From 1948 onwards, you see VP Menon basically taking center stage in the process of integration. Sardar Patel was getting sicker and sicker. And though he did certainly play a very important role in moments of integration, such as in Hyderabad, he basically left the legwork. He basically left the traveling across the length and breadth of India to VP. It was actually VP who went, met all the princes, got them to sign, which is why you see VP's signature on the instruments of accession. Because actually speaking, he was the face of the states ministry at that point. And there is another lovely anecdote that the Raja of Sarela left behind when he talked about how VP had come down to central India to sort of look at the integration of Bundelkhand and Bagelkhand. And all the princes of those provincialities had sort of gathered together at Sarela. And they were all sitting outside. It was apparently a very beautiful sunny day. VP was there speaking to some local leaders and politicians, and the Raja of Sarela recorded that, even though he was dressed very simply, and even though he was doing nothing to, throw his weight around or throw his ego around, every one of the princes there could see the power that he exuded, and every one of them could see that he was aware of the power that he exuded, which I thought was a very telling sort of insight into how VP himself was perceived among the princely states at that point. And you sort of see this right through till 1951, which is basically when the larger works of integration are done. Obviously, then 1953, the states began a process of reorganization, but VP was not in active government service at that point. His career took a definite slide into obscurity post the death of Sardar Patel. And this was largely due to his relationship with Nehru, which had never been the same since he chose to lie to Nehru in 1947. And he really never blamed Nehru for the downturn in their relationship, but he did blame him for immense pettiness in the face of Sardar Patel's death in 1950. And you basically see VP then being farmed out to the Finance Commission, where he was a sort of rubber stamp at that point. He was given acting governorship over Odisha for 6 months in 51. The States Ministry was closed down in April 1951. There were still a few things that VP still dealt with in the early months of 1951. The Maharaja of Bikaner, for instance, had died in England. VP was in charge of bringing back all the valuables that he had taken to London with him. There was a slightly scandalous incident where the Maharaja of Jodhpur was flying in some nightclub hostesses, as the States Ministry called them, into India. And there was a whole thing about denying them their passports and their entrance into India. So you had VP sort of mopping up the mess that was left behind from integration, but you also then see him slowly being edged out of political prominence at the time. And by 1951, he was very much out of government service. He was very much a private citizen. He was also a very sick man. The sickness had sort of started in the last stages of transfer of power and the early stages of integration. And by 1966, he would be dead. He certainly played a very important role in the founding of the Swatantra Party, which was basically started by a group of very disillusioned erstwhile congressmen who felt that the Congress was not moving towards socialism as it should have been. And he was one of the founding voices and the founding people of the Swatantra Party. But he did not have the health at that point to play an active role in campaigning. He stayed away from that. And his death was possibly as quiet as his rise to prominence in government service. And I'm glad that, writing this book has sort of helped resurrect him in some way. And I'm even gladder that I could sit here and talk to you about him today. So I'm going to stop here. But I mean, I don't know if anyone has questions or would like to ask any questions. But for now, I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very much for this fascinating summary of your book. I know, having read the book twice, I know that it is not a summary as such. But still, the interesting bits and pieces have come out very clearly. May I now request friends, if they have any comments or queries or observations to make.
CK, can I say something?
Yes, please, Sudha.
Narayani, I must tell you, this is a brilliant presentation, and it's so important to bring people like VP Menon into prominence, because it was not just a question of these the big names making India. It was all these people who worked hard behind the scenes. And I must say, the little I know about him, he was so self-effacing. He never really put himself forward anywhere. But there he was. I mean, every one of them, all his British bosses, Indian, Sardar Patel was so full of praise for him. I just wanted to know, how did not a very huge man, or, in the sense that he was a very compact person, I must say, in the sense, and how could he exude so much power just like that through his very quiet ways? He really pulled it off, I must say.
Yeah, he did. I think large came from the positions that he held at that point, because when I heard his voice, for instance, on the tapes in London, it was a bit of a shock for me, because when you hear the politicians and the political leaders of that period speaking, they speak in very cultured accents, very sort of Oxbridge educated accents, right? When you hear somebody like Jawaharlal Nehru speaking, for instance, when you hear Jinnah speaking, they're very articulately sort of cultured voices. His voice was actually very thickly Malayali.
Of course.
He had a definite accent, which, and his English was not, his spoken English was not the greatest. He was definitely not inarticulate. But in comparison to the people that I heard, and that you can hear on Pathe or any one of the archives that have been left to the Times, um, he was certainly not ever like that. And he just, I think it was because he kept himself really rooted in who he was. Um, and he never really lost sight of that. I think in the accounts that he left behind, in the tales that he told, people like Leonard Mosley or people like his brother, um, he was always very proud of where he came from. Not something he ever lost sight of, even when he reached where he reached. And I think that helped greatly to ground him. Um, that apart, I feel that when you are commanding that kind of power, by 1947-48, certainly he was not unaware that he held that kind of power. To be given complete permission to do whatever he liked to, as long as it was approved, so that gave him a lot of leeway in how to go about the process of integration. As long as
I'm sorry, I'm intervening. How did his colleagues who are ICS officers and the big names, how did they receive? How did they take to him? Was there a tension between them and him at any stage?
Between the people that he worked with, both British and Indian, and by that I mean people like Alan Johnson, who was attaché for Mountbatten, all of the senior British Raj officials, including Mountbatten himself, all of the people who worked with him in the reforms department, who worked with him in the home ministry at the time, states ministry. They've all left behind very praiseworthy accounts. You have people like H.M. Patel, for instance, who was a defense member at the time. And he was also working as part of the Partition Council, where he said that everything at that point, whether VP was associated with it professionally or not, everything was being run by VP, because that was the kind of respect that people had for him at that point. So, you have very praiseworthy accounts in oral histories that are left behind, which for me was greatly gratifying, obviously. But from whatever I read of the colleagues who worked with him, both sides, British and Indian, there was a lot of praise for the kind of commitment he brought to it, the process, the kind of investment, emotional investment. In fact, one of them, I think it was Sir Pendrell Moon, said that the VP's shortfall is that he gets emotionally invested in what he's doing, and to be emotionally invested in a process that was as sort of critical as this one, obviously does lead to a great strain on your physical and mental health, which it did. But no, the accounts that were left behind were immensely glowing.
Well done, Narayani. Congrats to you. Loved your talk.
Yeah.
Hey there, Narayani. Good evening
Hi.
to you.
Hi,
Nice to
love-
be interacting with you once again. I had a very quick question. Did VP ever consider writing his own accounts of what happened? Did he? I mean, not the transfer of power matters, but about his personal life and something like an autobiography. Did he ever consider doing that?
No, I mean, the answer to that would be definite no. He was not a very public man when it came to talking about his personal life. When it came to putting down things like this in a sort of stream of consciousness, he was not a serial diarist. He was not anything like that. I wish he had been. It would have made my work so much easier. But he was never somebody who even nurtured ambitions to write a memoir. The only reason we have the books on integration and transfer of power that we have today was because Sardar Patel had requested him on his deathbed to write this as an official narrative of what had happened. But even if you read those books, they're so dry and they're so textbook almost, they only state the facts, they only state the statistics, There is no emotion in those books. It is just a factual account of what happened. So he wasn't the kind of man who thought twice even about writing a memoir.
Well, one more comment I wanted to make. One person I miss most in this discussion is our late Premnath Murkut. He used to have a lot of interesting stories about VP, and we used to talk about it often, way before, of course, you wrote the book. But he used to tell me a little bit of those stories. Do you remember that, CK?
Yeah.
Premnath, yeah.
Yes.
May his soul rest in peace. Thank you, Narayani, for a very nice presentation.
Thank you so much.
Radi, sir, you're going to say something.
No, thank you. I'm delighted to listen to this. All right. I've loved his books. I loved your book too when I read it. And I hope to carry on with more of your books.
Thank
Please
you.
write more.
Any comment? Any questions? We have a formal vote of thanks from Dr. Noon. With that, we conclude this evening's program. Dr. Noon.
Can you hear?
Yeah.
Respected President of Calicut Heritage Forum, Professor M.J. Narayana, Ms. Narayani Basu, who delivered this year's Professor K.V. Krishna Endowment Lecture, our most valued guest this year on the electronic media. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this memorable occasion, the 7th Professor K.V. Krishna Endowment Lecture. On behalf of Calicut Heritage Forum, and on behalf, I extend a big thank you to our honored speaker, Ms. Narayani Basu, the author of critically acclaimed biography of that eminent bureaucrat V.P. Menon. The story of Menon interspersed with the story of India's independence and the period after it, as also stories of Nehru, Patel, and Mountbatten. To write the life story of a bureaucrat who led a life mostly buried in files and drafts can be challenging. Ms. Basu has succinctly explained the background of the writing and the history of a forgotten past. A brilliant presentation, Ms. Basu. So we must appreciate the generosity of and social commitment of the family of Professor K.V. Krishna Ayyar in instituting this endowment in his glorious memory. I sincerely thank Swaminathan family. Professor MJS has always been our inspiration and guiding light, and I thank him for his continued advice, encouragement, and involvement. An event like this cannot happen overnight. It requires meticulous planning and a bird's eye view for details. We have been fortunate enough to be led by our Secretary, Sri C.K. Ramyantran IAS. Finally, a big thank you for all those who are present here this evening in the cyber world. Thank you. Just one comment. This CKR has given me one guidance in one Neil Edmonston, a PhD thesis by Marla Chansey, and it's very interesting. VP and Neil Edmonston, both of them, who are actually the behind the scene maneuvers, but not getting into any sort of prominence. So I just thought it reminded me of the life history of Neil Edmonston. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Narayani, for a very memorable evening. Calicut Heritage Forum is grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.